afternoon and welcome to the Freud Museum. We are honoured to have with us today Professor Mark Solms, a distinguished psychoanalyst and neuropsychologist whose contributions to his chosen fields have been profound and far-reaching. Mark Solms is Professor of Neuropsychology at the University of Cape Town in South Africa and serves as Honorary Lecturer in Neurosurgery at St. Bartholomew's and Lower London School of Medicine. He is also the director of the Arnold Pfeffer Center for Neuropsychoanalysis at the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, and chair of the research committee of the International Psychoanalytical Association. Professor Solms is president of the South African Psychoanalytical Association, an associate member of the British Psychological Society, and an honorary member of the New York Psychoanalytic Society. Professor Solms has overseen the long and eagerly awaited revised standard edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud. It is a timely and momentous work of scholarship, and we'll hear more about it later, so all things in good time. For now, however, Professor Solms will address the hard problem of consciousness. Of particular interest, given our surroundings here today, he will discuss the relevance of two Freudian ideas in the solution of this problem. So, without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Mark Solms.
I have been asked to talk for about half an hour, but I must tell you, the hard problem of consciousness is thought to be, well, certainly the biggest problem in mental science, if not the biggest problem in the whole of science today. So to try to talk on this topic for 30 minutes is crazy. But here we go. This is a drawing of the cortex, focusing on the visual cortex. This is a diagram of the information flow mechanisms that we believe operate in that cortex. This is a mechanistic account, a high-level one, sort of as things stand today, of what we understand about how vision works. Now, the hard problem of consciousness starts from this. It says, where in this is the experience of seeing? Where in this is the subject who is processing all this information? Where is the actual stuff of vision? This gives us an account of the functional mechanism, but that functional mechanism tells us nothing about what it is like to see, or indeed why there is something it is like to see at all. The story is told of Mary, the visual neuroscientist, who knows all of this. She knows everything there is to know about the functional mechanisms of vision, but she's blind. So she has never experienced what it is like to see. And the point is that if she were, thanks be to God, one day gifted with the ability to see, she will learn something utterly new about vision. Something that this mechanistic understanding that she had prior to having the experience of seeing didn't prepare her for what it is like to see, didn't explain why there should be anything it is like to see. And that's the hard problem of consciousness. This is David Chalmers's famous formulation of it in 1995. This is the problem. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? That's the question, that's the problem. This problem, as formulated by Chalmers, who gave it the name, the hard problem, builds upon an earlier argument by Thomas Nagel in a wonderful paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? From 1974, and he put it like this. Nagel did. Why and how is there something it is like to be an organism? Something it is like for the organism. Now, as Giuseppe prepared you for, I'm now going to tell you, I think that the reason why we've made so little progress with this problem is precisely because we are focused on vision as our model example of consciousness. In the year before Chalmers published his his famous paper. That is to say, in 1994, Francis Crick published a book with the title The Astonishing Hypothesis. And this is where he said, this is no longer a metaphysical problem. The problem of how consciousness relates to physical matter is now a scientific problem. All we need to do is identify how visual consciousness arises, identify its neural mechanism, and then generalize from that to the whole of consciousness. And we will have empirically, scientifically, mechanistically accounted for where consciousness sits in nature. And that led Chalmers to say, well, that mechanistic account doesn't tell you anything about what it is like to see, why there should be something it's like to see, etc., etc. And I'm saying Chalmers has a point, that in fact, had we not focused on vision and on the visual cortex, which is the scene of action of vision what's his name, Crick suggested we use as the model example from which we generalize, had we not started there, I don't think the problem would ever have arisen in the form that it has. And the reason for that, well, actually, I'm not telling you the reason for that. Let me first of all say, it's not unreasonable that Crick should have started there, because we have long known that all of our perceptual modalities, vision from the eye, taste from the tongue, hearing from the ear, and so on, that all of these sense organs project via these fiber pathways to the cortex. And there is a specific area dedicated to each one of our special senses. In the case of vision, it's this green area here, that's the visual cortex. We've always known that if you damage the visual cortex, you lose visual experience. If you damage auditory cortex, you lose auditory experience. So it seemed fairly reasonable to think, well, this is where we should look for the neural correlates, the neural mechanisms of perception. Perception being, please note, look at your experience right now, your consciousness is dominated by perception. And perception comes in 5 sort of raw ingredients: visual ingredients, auditory ingredients, somatosensory ones, olfactory ones, gustatory ones. This is what consciousness is made of. So consciousness is made of these 5 things. These are the cortical zones where they seem to be generated. And so let's focus on the obvious one, vision, and generalize from there. I'm saying that's not an unreasonable strategy, but here's the reason why it's problematical. And this is the first Freudian idea that I'm smuggling into this talk. Vision, and indeed all perception, is not intrinsically conscious. You can see unconsciously. You can hear unconsciously. All of our special senses do function consciously, but also unconsciously. Here is a famous review paper by Kihlstrom summarizing everything that we knew on this score in the late 1990s. And the title of the paper says it all: Perception without awareness of what is perceived, learning without awareness of what is learned. We are perfectly capable of seeing things unconsciously and of being influenced by those things, in other words, learning from what we have seen or perceived in any other sensory modality for that matter, and having no idea that we've done so. So, for example, using an instrument called a tachistoscope, which flashes visual information ever so briefly at a millisecond level, you look into this instrument, visual information is presented to you, and you can show after this presentation that you are influenced by what you've seen, even though you have not experienced any visual anything. An outstanding example is an experiment in which research participants were shown faces for just a few milliseconds in this instrument. They saw nothing consciously, but these faces, face A was accompanied by a word rapist, also on the slide, and face B was accompanied by the word philanthropist. Then after these images had been flashed for milliseconds, which, as I said, is not accompanied by any visual experience, the person is not aware of having seen anything, they're then shown supraliminary the actual photographs of person A and person B and asked, which of these two do you prefer? And they say, I don't know these guys. And then you're forced to choose, just say, but from your gut feeling, which one do you prefer? They all prefer person B. So clearly they have seen something, although they weren't aware of it. The something that they've seen is a face, which is a rather complex kind of vision, and it's a uniquely cortical kind of vision. And what's more, they have read a word with comprehension, and they've learned to associate that word with that face. All of this unconsciously. And these functions are cortical functions. These functions are, in fact, when it comes to reading words, uniquely human cortical functions. So these are the highest levels of cortical functions, and all of it can happen without consciousness. So think back to what Chalmers said. He said, why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark? Well, indeed. In fact, most of the time it does go on in the dark. It's perfectly capable of going on in the dark. What Mary, the blind visual neuroscientist, knows about the cortical mechanisms of vision, it doesn't require that there is something it is like to see. The mechanism works perfectly well without there being any visual experience attached. That's where the hard problem comes from. It seems as if the experience is kind of unnecessary, kind of epiphenomenal, kind of exists in some other realm from the physical, mechanistic, natural world that people like Mary are talking about. So this is my first Freudian idea, because it was Freud who first introduced us to this notion that perception and cognition, all of these mental gymnastics that we're so proud of, do not require consciousness to go on. Most of our mental life, in fact, nowadays, as this title suggests, it's not at all controversial in cognitive science that mental processes, cognitive processes can go on unconsciously, including perceptual ones, and indeed they do go on unconsciously most of the time. So this is why I'm saying that's not the right place to start. Why start with a function which is not intrinsically conscious as your model example, your scene of action of where consciousness is generated in the brain? Why not instead start from this place? It's called the reticular activating system. It's colored in here in the brainstem. This is the visual cortex up here. There it is. And as I told you, that's perfectly capable of functioning unconsciously. Down here is something called the reticular activating system, which is where the consciousness comes from. We all thought consciousness flows in with our visual and other perceptual experience, but it's actually not true. That information flows in unconsciously, and it is only rendered conscious to the extent that it is that the cortex processing that information is activated by the reticular activating system. That's what makes the visual information processing or any other information processing going on in the cortex, that's what makes it conscious. That's why it's called the reticular activating system. It arouses the cortex. And if the reticular activating system is separated from the cortex, as was done by Maruzzi and Magoon in 1949 already, they separated the reticular activating system deep in the core of the primitive brainstem. They separated that from the cortex and showed that the cortex, from that moment onwards, ceases to function consciously. It still functions, it still processes information, but not consciously. So that absolutely proves the point that the consciousness comes from the reticular activating system. In more recent years, there should be a name here, Fisher et al. in 2018, identified that the smallest area of damage in the human brain that reliably produces coma is a 2 cubic millimeter part of the reticular activating system. So think of that. An area of damage the size of a match head is all that's needed to obliterate consciousness in each and every one of us. This is the most concentrated consciousness-producing tissue that there is. So why didn't we start there? Why start in the visual cortex, which, as I keep telling you, in fact, processes visual information perfectly well without consciousness? Why not start here? It's because the way in which Magoon and Maruzzi interpreted their findings, which were a complete surprise to them. You know, what do you do when you find them that this thing that we've known for 100 years, that the cortex is the seat of consciousness, suddenly is thrown upside down. Suddenly it's clearly not true. The visual information and other perceptual information goes into the cortex and it's not conscious unless it's activated by this endogenous arousal process coming from deep within the ancient brainstem. That was a big surprise. So the way that they explained it was to say, well, what the brainstem does is it generates a background level of arousal. It's a kind of prerequisite switching on of the machinery, and then the machinery processes the actual contents of consciousness. So they said the cortex is responsible for the contents and the qualities of consciousness, and the reticular activating system of the brainstem is responsible for a level or quantity of consciousness. It's sort of like switching it on and turning up the volume, but it's not the actual programming. And in fact, the analogy was used of a television set having to be plugged in at the wall before it can do its televisual thing. It's necessary prerequisite to watch television that you switch it on and plug it in. But that doesn't mean that really the source of television is the power socket at the wall. That's just a precondition, a prerequisite, a necessary sort of background factor. But the programming, the quality, the content of the programming, the actual images that we watch and listen to are processed by the television set itself, not by the power source. So this was seen as a power source for the actual organ of consciousness up here. That was the argument. Now, what I'm going to spend, what little time I have, the bulk of that little time, I'm going to spend showing you that this view is wrong. It's not true. It's not true that the brainstem provides only a background level or quantity or power supply which enables the cortex to process the contents and qualities of consciousness. I really need to emphasize this. Please note the view that the quality, the actual qualia, as the philosophers call it, the actual phenomenal stuff of experience, they're saying that's what the cortex provides. What this provides is a power switch, which boots the machinery up to be able to do that. That's what I'm going to show you is not true. And I'm only going to give you brief illustrative examples of the evidence. Obviously, I can't summarize all the evidence for you in a little talk like this. So, bit of evidence number one. Here is a child, or the brain scan of a child, who was born with a condition called hydranencephaly, which means born without any cortex. Okay, so if the cortex is the scene of action for the qualities and contents of consciousness, this child should possibly be in a coma. But if we grant Magoon and Maritz's view that there's this prerequisite background power supply, she should have the power supply without the contents and the qualities. So she should have some sort of blank wakefulness. It's hard to imagine what blank wakefulness might be like. But there is a condition in neurology called the vegetative state, more politely known as non-responsive wakefulness, which is a term we give to patients who are, as it were, in a coma, but the one respect in which they're not in a coma is they still have a sleep-wake cycle. So they wake up in the morning and they just sit there staring blankly into this empty space, doing nothing, responding to nothing, and then they go to sleep at night. And then in the morning they wake. So that's something like what you might expect these children to be like, because they have no cortex, never have had any cortex. But that's not what happens. Here's the girl whose scan you've just seen. Here you can see she's awake. She's not in a coma. But much more interestingly, you see what happens when her baby brother is placed on her lap. She goes, ah! She likes it. If you take her brother away, she goes, ah, ah. She doesn't like it. If you startle her, she gets a fright. If you prick her with a pin, she cries, because you've hurt her. And so on. All the emotional responses that you would expect from anyone, any child, she displays them. So she's not only conscious, her consciousness has a quality, and that quality is emotional. She is affectively present. There's somebody home. This person, it feels like something to be her, and that quality of her experience and the content of her experience is affective, not cognitive. And she's not the only one. This is routinely what we find with these kids. Here's another example of a child with absolutely no cortex, clearly conscious and emotionally responsive. Remember the term for the vegetative state? Non-responsive wakefulness. And I'm saying this child does not fit the prediction. The prediction from the theory that the cortex is where the contents and qualities of consciousness reside, that requires that children like this should be blank and unresponsive, and they're not. They are emotionally responsive. Their consciousness does have quality, it does have content. Now I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, how the hell do they respond if they're blind and deaf and so on, which they are. Consciously blind and deaf and so on. But let me point out, that slide I showed you earlier, I said it's not unreasonable that we thought the cortex was the seat of consciousness, because look, all the sensory organs project onto it. What that slide did not show, and that's a standard textbook slide, what it did not show is something else we know which is that alongside the pathway from the sensory organs to the cortex, there's another pathway from the sensory organs to the brainstem, to this area here called the superior colliculi, which is right next to a structure called the periaqueductal gray. And I might as well tell you right now, the periaqueductal gray is the most intensely affective structure in the brain. So what happens is this information goes into the brainstem, the visual information, auditory information, somatosensory information, it goes in, and it is processed unconsciously. Just like I told you about the tachistoscope experiment, they receive the information, they just don't know they've received the information. So she has a gut feeling, this is nice, when her brother is placed on her lap, because she's received that information, the tactile information of her brother being placed on her lap. She just doesn't experience that tactile information. All she experiences is the emotional response to it. This is nice. She doesn't know what's nice or why it's nice, but it's nice. Just like you don't know why you're responding to the space that you believe you've never seen. You just have a gut feeling that that guy I don't like, this one I do like. I don't know why. Okay, so that's the way in which these kids' brains function. They're conscious emotionally. So now, when I present this evidence to my colleagues, and it wasn't me who first presented this evidence, it was David Schumann in the late 90s, a pediatric neurologist, who said that we're making a big mistake here, treating these kids as if they were vegetative. They're clearly not. And it's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, the way that we don't actually interact with them. And he changed pediatric practice with these kids. Then Bjorn Merker studied them, and it was only subsequent to that that I drew this to the attention of my colleagues. And they said, well, how do you know those kids are conscious? They can't speak. Maybe they're just like philosophical zombies. Maybe this is all just reflex and instinct. I must tell you, these colleagues have never interacted with these kids. Anyone who's interacted with these kids, it's like crazy, to think that this is actually a machine. But they say, how do we know? Radical skepticism. Because they can't report their conscious states, they possibly do not have conscious states. Just like pre-verbal children can't report their conscious states, it doesn't mean they're machines. Just like your pet dogs and cats and so on can't report their conscious states, you can infer it from everything that happens, that these are emotionally responsive, beings. There's somebody home. It feels like something to be a Labrador. But they say, how do we know? So all we can do is say, okay, let's use different sort of evidence. So I move to exhibit 2. Now remember, the evidence I've shown you so far is that if you damage one tiny part of the brain, the size of a match head, you lose all consciousness. And that is in the brain stem, in the reticular activating system. If you damage the whole of the cortex, you don't get a coma. Instead, you get a responsive emotional being. And they say, well, maybe it's not really an emotional being, maybe it's a robot, so let's try another method. If the brain stem is where the consciousness in the form of feeling is being generated, then you might predict if you put an electrode into the reticular activating system and stimulate it, you will produce an emotional feeling. Not so. You won't produce more or less level, the kind of thing an anesthetist might do. Instead, you'll produce a feeling, the sort of thing that psychiatric drugs might do. And that's what happens. This patient had an electrode placed into her substantia nigra, and again, I'm just giving you one example, an illustrative example. This sort of thing has been documented time and time and time again. This is a part of the reticular activating system. An electrode happened to be placed in this patient's brain for the treatment of Parkinson's disease. The surgeon was aiming for a structure immediately above this one, not part of the reticular activating system, something called the subthalamic nucleus, but the electrode went 2 millimeters too deep into this structure, and this woman, 65 years old, with no psychiatric history whatsoever, immediately fell into a suicidal depression. I'm not going to read all of this because we don't have time, but the point is, within 5 seconds, I've highlighted the yellow bits, to illustrate what I mean by suicidal depression. Within 30 seconds of the surgeon, whose name was Blanchett, within 30 seconds of him switching off the electrode, the depression lifted. And the patient very kindly allowed him to switch it on again. And she went straight back into this profound, and then he did it a few times without her knowing whether it was on or off. And every time that he switched the electrode on, she fell back into this depression. Remember, this is one illustrative example. So it's exactly what you would expect if the feelings are actually being generated in the brainstem. Then if you stimulate the brainstem, you'll stimulate the feeling. So that, I think, gets around the objection about those kids possibly being machines. But here's another method that we can use, leading us to the same conclusion. If you image the brain, take what's called a positron emission tomogram of the brain, which allows you to literally visualize which parts are activated when the person is in a particular state of mind. And in this instance, they are in intense emotional states of mind. Where do you think the activation would be? Well, if the cortex was generating this type of consciousness, then the activation would be in the cortex. If the brainstem is what's generating it, the activation would be in the brainstem, and that's exactly what we find. So here are people in profoundly sad states. The activation, which is shown in the warm colors, is in their brainstem. Same with anger, same with fear, same with happiness. The cortex, not much is going on there. And by the way, I should have said to you about this stimulation stuff. I did sort of briefly mention it earlier, that if you stimulate the periaqueductal gray in the brainstem, you get the most intense and the widest range of emotions from anywhere else in the brain. Second most after the periaqueductal gray is the whole of the reticular activating system. Stimulate cortex, you get hardly any emotion at all. You get memories of emotional experiences, thoughts about emotional experiences. You don't actually get the raw experiences. And remember, with these cases that I'm showing you, it's intense. Last exhibit, these neurotransmitters, well-known dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, these are the neurotransmitters that the mainstay of psychopharmacological treatments manipulate these chemicals in the brain. Antidepressants, they increase serotonin. Antipsychotics, they decrease dopamine. Anti-anxiety drugs, they decrease noradrenaline. Where do these chemicals come from? They are all sourced in the reticular activating system. These are the source cells for the neurotransmitter systems that psychiatrists tinker with. What are psychiatrists treating? They're not treating the level of consciousness like anesthetists, they're treating feelings. So you manipulate the neurotransmitters that are sourced in the reticular activating system, and you manipulate feelings. That's the whole point of psychopharmacological agents. So the lesion evidence, the deep brain stimulation evidence, the imaging evidence, and the pharmacological evidence all points to the same conclusion, namely that feelings are generated here in the brainstem. That the brainstem does not just switch on the lights. It is not just a volume control switch, or it is not just something like a power source at the wall. It generates a quality and a content of consciousness that we call feeling, that we call affect, that we call emotion. And this leads us to the second Freudian idea that I'm smuggling into my talk. Freud, the discoverer of the unconscious, the discoverer of the things that were rediscovered in the 1980s and 1990s, by experiments of the kind that I told you about with the tachistoscope, that you can see and learn and have all kinds of cognitive gymnastics without any consciousness attached. Freud taught us that 100 years earlier. Freud discovered that perception and cognition, all of these mental processes, even at the highest cognitive levels, can go on in the dark. But Freud, that same person, said this: it's surely of the essence of an emotion that we should be aware of it. That is, that it should become known to consciousness. Thus, the possibility of the attribute of unconsciousness would be completely excluded as far as emotions, feelings, and affects are concerned. So the discoverer of the unconscious says everything in the mind can be unconscious except for a feeling. And if you think about it, well, of course, how can you have a feeling that you don't feel? If you have a feeling that you don't feel, then it's not a feeling. And this is why I've emphasized that word, not emotions and affects, because there are all kinds of arguments we can have about how you can defend yourself against emotions, how you can split yourself off from your affects, only show the physiological response, not have the conscious experience. But that doesn't apply to feelings. Feelings are intrinsically conscious things. So what I'm saying is this is where we should have started. We shouldn't have started with the cortex, which generates information processing in relation to perceptual functions which are not intrinsically conscious functions. They work perfectly well unconsciously. They only become conscious secondarily when they are activated, modulated by the brainstem, aroused by the brainstem, palpated by feelings. We feel our way into our cognitions, and that's how we become conscious of them. So we should have started here with feelings, a function, a mental function which is intrinsically necessarily conscious. And it's not just, please notice, not a semantic point. I'm not saying this is an oxymoron to say an unconscious feeling. I'm saying the part of the brain, the intrinsic function of which is to generate consciousness, namely the reticular activating system. That's what it's there for. That's why it's called the reticular activating system. This part of the brain generates feelings. Feelings are the quality and the content that attach to what we call arousal, what we call activation, what the so-called power source is generating. So since we all accept that the power source is a necessary precondition, everybody agrees that you can't have consciousness unless the reticular activating system is activating the cortex. Everybody agrees that the cortex does not have to function consciously. Most cognition is unconscious. The part of the brain that generates the arousal that renders our cognition conscious is the part of the brain that generates feelings. And so it's in this sense that I'm saying we should have started there. Clearly this is the foundational form, the bedrock of consciousness. All other forms of consciousness are contingent and dependent upon this kind of consciousness. But this kind of consciousness is not just a level. It's not just a quantity. It is a quality. It has a phenomenal content called feeling, affect, arousal. This emotional stuff is the foundational form of consciousness. We should have started there. David Chalmers, back to him. I've got to end here. I'm at the end of my half hour, very nearly at the end of it. David Chalmers, in that paper that I cited earlier, the famous paper in which he articulated the hard problem of consciousness, he said the following. I'm not going to read you the whole quote. He says this at the end. It's the nub of the matter. There is no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. So what he's saying is, that's what I was saying at the beginning about vision, that explaining the mechanism of the function of emotion, of the information processing that goes on in the cortex doesn't tell you why there is something it is like to experience vision. And this is what Chalmers is saying here. He says there's no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that mechanism will automatically explain experience. And I'm saying the problem here is the word cognitive. If we replace it with this, if we have Chalmers saying there is no affective function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience, I'm saying there is one. It's called feeling. You cannot possibly explain the mechanism of feeling without it necessarily explaining in advance why you have to experience it. Because that's the whole point of feeling, is to feel it. So if you give a mechanistic account of feeling, it will necessarily, I can say in advance, it will explain the experience of feeling. This is what I think is at stake. If we were to shift from the cortex to the brainstem, from perception and cognition to raw feelings, I think that the hard problem becomes a very much less hard problem. So what is the function of feeling? Feeling functions homeostatically. This is a homeostat. Basically, we have a set point, and all living things, by the way, function homeostatically. We all have to be in certain viable bounds. That's what we call the set point. You need to be at a certain body temperature, certain amount of oxygen, certain amount of water, certain amount of sugar, etc. If you're not within your viable bounds, you die. So homeostasis, if you move out of those bounds, that's a demand on your body to do something, a demand for work, and then effective work brings you back to where you need to be. This is the main task of life, staying alive, staying within your biologically viable bounds. And I've got the word prediction here. Basically, it's a funny word, but that's the word we use. There has to be some built-in prediction that tells you what to do. So, for example, if you get too hot like I am now, what you do is you perspire. It's a reflex. And you breathe more shallowly and more rapidly, you pant. And this is predicted through natural selection, through evolution, through what worked for your ancestors. This is predicted to cool you down. So that's what you do. But I'm talking about bodily functions here. The same applies to higher emotional functions. Some of these bodily homeostatic reflexes we feel, some we don't feel. I'm now feeling hot. Okay? So that's called unpleasure in Freudian terms. the unpleasure, the unpleasant feeling, it enables you to actually register, I am not where I need to be. This is bad for me. And by the way, when I say this is bad for me, it is an intrinsic value built into all living things. It's bad to die. It's good to stay alive. Okay, this is the value system of biology. And the value system of psychology built upon that is good feelings are good things. I aspire to have them. I try to be in pleasurable states. And unpleasurable states are bad things, and I avoid them. This is what feelings are for. They tell you, they raise you above the level of reflexes, like blood pressure regulation and so on, to being able to actually know how well or badly am I doing in terms of my basic biological needs. So I said it's not just bodily needs. So for example, one of our needs is I must not be in danger. There must not be a threat to life and limb. If there is, I feel fear. Okay, that's what the negative is. And the blue one is the relief of if I do the right thing, then I suffer, I no longer suffer fear, I now feel the relief. And the same applies to, let's say, separation distress. We need to be close to our attachment objects. If we're separated from them, bad thing, bad feeling. Well, what do? I try something, if it works, good. Okay, so you learn from the experience. So we have reflexes and instincts, those predictions that I mentioned in this first slide. But then when you're in states of uncertainty, where you don't know what to do, feelings guide your choices. It enables you to make choices. Otherwise, you would just behave randomly. You know, the good feeling tells you, yes, this is working. The bad feeling tells you, no, things are getting worse. Imagine you're in a burning building, carbon dioxide in the air. When you breathe in, your normal reflex doesn't cut it because now you're breathing in carbon dioxide. So you feel suffocation alarm. So I don't know what to do. I've never been in a burning building. I'll run upstairs. It gets worse. So I change my mind. I go downstairs instead. Relief. Okay, the feeling tells me whether I've done the right or the wrong thing. That's what feelings are for. That's the function of feelings. And I've just given you a mechanistic account of why we have feelings and what they do. And if Mary were an affective neuroscientist and she knew the mechanism I've just described to you, she would know that feelings feel like something. She would know that they have a particular quality, a goodness and a badness to them, and also that they have categorical qualities. Fear has a different quality to suffocation alarm, has a different quality to thirst, has a different quality to sleepiness, has a different quality to rage, and so on. Each one of these qualities tells us which one of our homeostats is out of kilter, which one of our needs is not being met. So what I've just described is a mechanism which is intrinsically, consciously felt, qualitative in its essence, and has to be. This is how it works. So I think that this is a different way in which we can approach the hard problem of consciousness. I think that a mechanistic account of feeling, it tells us why. I remember this question: why and how is there something it is like to be an organism? Something it's like for the organism. This is, remember, Nagel's question. You know, if you ask this about vision, you can say, yeah, why? Why do you have to have visual experience? But ask this about feeling, what I've just said. You know, it's clear why there is something it is like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism, if the foundational, fundamental form of consciousness is feeling. Back to Chalmers again, to the hard problem. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? Feelings can't go on in the dark, free of any inner field. That's what they are. They are inner fields. And you can't do the thing I've just described. You can't make choices that underwrite voluntary behavior if you have no value system that supports it, and there's no quality to tell you, is this good or bad for me in this, that, or the other respect. These things necessarily must be felt. The function of the feelings actually do something. They enable us to act voluntarily. They underwrite choice. So I will end there. That's it. Thanks very much.